My name is Albert Connor. I was born in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Philadelphia. I came to Virginia in 1962 to go to the Virginia Military Institute. And spiritually, physically, we haven't left much since, but I served 12 years in the U.S. Army, and I got out in 1978, and we moved to Stafford from Fort Bragg, and I worked for the last 18 years of my federal service with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington. So for about the first 20 years of my life in Stafford, we traveled every morning to Washington and came home in the dark every night. And I didn't learn much about Stafford until after my first wife passed on. I worked for another 6 months, and I was a single mother for 3 years with my 3 sons and my father-in-law in his 90s. And one evening I went to the Stafford County Historical Society to hear an artist that did military art. And Jane was the president at that time, and that's where we met. And up until that point, I hadn't been east of Route 1 in Stafford County, and I knew virtually nothing about the history of Stafford. And I remarked at the time that I was dumbstruck, frankly, at how much history Stafford had. And at the meeting that I attended, one of the people there said, "You know, we have quite a history of our own." And I thought that didn't really require much of an explanation since there was so much history. But I subsequently came to learn that Stafford's history has gotten molded into the history of the region, perhaps to a greater extent than it could have or should have. And so we sort of have to understand our history from our own perspective and not in the context of Fredericksburg or any of the surrounding areas, even though we're joined at the hip with all of the jurisdictions here. And we hope that in producing the histories here, that will increase the amount of civic pride that people could have and should have about Stafford, that has really been missing because of that sort of loss of identity. And that loss goes back a surprising distance. And people especially people who came from other places, were always confused by it. I remember a letter from a Methodist minister describing the fact that he lived in Falmouth, but everybody considers that he lives in Fredericksburg. And that was right before the Civil War. So it's been a problem for a long time. The southern Stafford has tended more to identify with Fredericksburg. Ironically, that's where a lot of our greatest history took place. So that's been both good for Stafford, and it's been a weak point for Stafford, historically speaking. There are different cultures in many respects, but over the years, Stafford's changed so much. Stafford once was Fredericksburg-oriented or Washington-oriented, kind of the bedroom community. But really that's changed dramatically. The economic development has shifted more to in and around Stafford. So that north-south delineation really hasn't really hung in there all that time. It's fascinating to watch this and the impact that it still has on our daily lives. But so few people understand our history that they don't realize that they're driving by or living near to things that have a very important national significance. We use the phrase nationally significant local history. And that's really when you get to the heart of matters, that's what Stafford is really all about. This isn't just a rural Virginia county. This is a rural Virginia county that's one of America's oldest places. And it has such a tremendous tie to all of our history as a country and some of our very first places. And the farther back you go, prehistoric, even into the early historic periods, you start to see that picture emerge where the things that happen here are directly related to the things that are happening in Washington City as the new capital, or just Virginia in general as one of the premier early colonies. Well, one of the things we had always hoped, and we still hope, is that tourism here will be unlike tourism generally in Virginia rural counties. That this is a place where you can bring your friends and relatives and you can show them the local history and you can make those ties. So yes, it is one of the first things that drips from your lips after you get past the American Indian experience here. This is where his formative years took place. And George Washington and George Mason, our two Georges, both had their boyhood homes here, both had very similar life histories, grew together in the love of liberty, but split apart over the governance of the country after the war. Washington, a pragmatic person who learned everything at relatively young ages by experience, as opposed to Mason, who was really the intellectual political thought theoretician that was focused almost exclusively on liberty. George Washington, of course, believed those same things, but he knew that under the Articles of Confederation, we didn't really have a country that was reunified. So he becomes Union-focused and Mason becomes liberty-focused. And that decision of whether it's liberty and Union or Union and liberty ultimately will drive this country through the Civil War. And one of the things that I've gotten here, particularly as a volunteer at Chatham, is the understanding that amazingly eluded me growing up in Philadelphia of how important the Revolutionary era is to the Civil War, just as the Civil War is important to World War II, the three great epics of American history. We have this sort of evolving history, all compacted in a pretty small area. So you find all these ties to George Washington and Ferry Farm wrapped up in the Civil War. And one of my favorite Civil War stories is how on 22nd of February 1863, the Union Army fires a salute to the Union on George Washington's birthday, and the Confederates across the river fire a return salute, admittedly a lot less powder being expended, and one of their bands plays one of the old national airs. Unfortunately, we don't know which one. So here, for this brief moment, we reunify around the figure of George Washington.